Line is open.
Good afternoon, and welcome to a seasonal look at the regulations concerning gifts from outside sources. My name is Patrick Shepard, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Kim Kaplan and Suzanne Meyer, who are both desk officers here at OGE. So welcome.
Well, thanks, Patrick.
Thanks.
It's really good to have you here. As we know, this is the time of year when we like to talk about gifts. And this presentation is also timely because we published just this morning a new legal advisory concerning gifts of farewell parties. So today we're going to be taking a broader look, sort of a full scope look at the rules concerning gifts from outside sources. And I know you both have a lot to cover, and we want to make sure we get that in and make sure that we're considerate of all of your time, our viewers and listeners. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to pull up your slides.
That sounds great.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, thank you, Patrick. So today we're going to look at Subpart B of the standards, gifts from outside sources. And we also know that around this time of year, employees do sometimes exchange gifts with each other and wonder about whether they can give a gift to a colleague. And we're not covering that today, but there is a link to a video titled Gifts Between Employees, an overview of Subpart C in the resources handout we provided for you, which you can see below this video.
And if you take a look below this video, you'll see the resources we provide for you include a copy of Subpart B of the gifts from outside sources, covering all gifts from outside sources, Executive Order 13770, ethics commitments by executive branch appointees, and a copy of the ethics pledge that they sign. We've also included a document on the VTIA analysis process, which you'll soon learn about. And finally, we've provided you with a one-page document of active links to the gifts advisories, the gifts between employees training Kim mentioned, and a link to the ethics research blog and other gifts from outside sources training. So if you've printed these out, great, but if you haven't, you'll still be able to follow the presentation.
I think this is a good time to remind folks that this presentation, along with all of the other broadcasts, are available for on-demand viewing immediately upon their conclusion, and you can find those all in the Institute for Ethics and Government Education Library.
Right. So this afternoon, we'll take you through the advice and counsel process and emphasize the relatively new standard for gifts analysis located in section 2635.201 of the standards, the consideration for declining otherwise permissible gifts. We'll discuss why we now analyze for appearances and integrity first and apply the reasonable person standard before we even ask the question, can the gift be accepted? And we'll reinforce for you throughout that, sometimes it's prudent to decline an otherwise permissible gift.
Right. And then we'll look at the gift rules prohibitions on certain gifts from outside sources, and then discuss the exceptions to the gift rule. And then finally, we'll take you through from some gifts from outside sources scenarios, variations of which you're likely to come across this holiday season.
Mm-hmm. So the graphic here shows that the advice and counsel process is often, but not always, circular. So let's say we've got an employee on the phone with an ethics question. It's good to know the rules, or at least where they and any relevant statutes or OGE legal advisories are located. So know what resources you need to assist an employee.
Right. OGE's legal advisories provide further clarity to the regulations.
Mm-hmm. So gather your resources and make sure you've got all the relevant facts. You don't want to give hasty guidance before you've had a chance to consider all the facts and fill in any gaps in the information the employee presented. As Patrick has said in earlier trainings, rarely is a perfectly formed fact pattern presented by employees when they come to you with an ethics question.
I've been doing this for a long time, and I've found that to be a very unusual instance when you don't have at least one or two follow-up questions.
Exactly.
Definitely. So you're going to get some more facts, and then you're going to apply the rules to those facts. And you might find that other rules come into play. It's a gifts question, but does it implicate the bribery statute? Or maybe the gift is reportable on a financial disclosure report.
Right. On the surface, the scenario an employee presents may appear to be a straightforward gifts question, but then as new details emerge, other laws or regulations may be implicated. So I bet many of you listening and watching today have received an ethics question from an employee, only to later learn there are additional facts which significantly change the outcome of your guidance. And I certainly know that Patrick, Kim, and I have.
Definitely.
Many, many times.
So the gift analysis process shown here is the analytical framework for analyzing a gift from an outside source. This first step is new, and it asks the employee to consider whether accepting the gift would lead a reasonable person to question the employee's impartiality or integrity. And if the employee answers yes, then the analysis is complete, and the employee should consider either not accepting the gift, or if the employee has already accepted it, properly disposing of the gift. It's only after this that the employee should ask, is it a gift? Is it prohibited? And if so, is there an exception available?
But I think this is really important because it really emphasizes the reason we have gift rules. We're concerned that gifts will affect the integrity of people's government service. So asking that up front makes sense to me.
Exactly. Yeah, it does make a lot of sense to ask that up front. And for you as an ethics official out there, what this first step means is that when employees come to you for ethics advice, you shouldn't give your guidance until the employee has done this analysis, either on their own or with support from you on how to walk through the process and what to consider. And also, you should do your own analysis so that you can provide prudential guidance to the employee. And then finally, if you're providing your guidance in written form, we really want you to consider including the employee's analysis of these factors in that guidance to help, again, to emphasize for employees that this is a formal part of the analysis.
And we know if you've been in ethics for a while, you know that this way of thinking, it may still feel new to you, even though the changes became effective January 1st, 2017. And I think it's because the way we analyzed gifts from outside sources hadn't changed at all since the standards were first issued in 1993. But OGE intentionally made changes to this framework for reasons we're going to get more into as we go along.
Mm-hmm. So this new step is set out as a formal part of the analysis process in the Standards of Conduct at 5 CFR 2635.201B.
It is. And it's rooted in the basic obligation of public service at section 2535.101 of the standards.
Right, it is. And it's based on the responsibility each employee has to place loyalty to the United States, its citizens, the Constitution, laws, and ethical principles above private gain.
Mm-hmm, right. And this new step in the gifts analysis process is designed to promote the public's confidence that employees are meeting this responsibility.
So the regulation highlights 4 factors that employees should consider. And those factors are value, timing, identity of the donor, and access that the gift provides.
And if the employee is aware of any other factor outside of those listed here that could cause their impartiality to be questioned, the employee should consider those as well.
Right. Just as with the general impartiality analysis that we're already familiar with in section 2635.502, the employee should consider other circumstances, even if they aren't among the 4 highlighted here.
Right. What we're doing is we're putting a spotlight on these particular factors here so that employees and ethics officials can use them as guideposts and make a habit of considering them in their gifts analysis.
I guess this is familiar to anyone who's used Subpart E of the standards to make an impartiality determination. We have some guideposts in the regulation, but that doesn't mean we should ignore other relevant factors.
Exactly.
Definitely consider other circumstances. So now we're going to look at these factors in greater detail. With value, what are we asking? Well, here we're asking employees to consider the market value of the gift. Is it relatively expensive or is it relatively cheap?
And truthfully, no matter what the cost of the gift, even if it has little intrinsic value, we still want employees to consider all of the factors. The full context matters.
Right. Right. And then with timing, here what we're looking at is whether there's some sensitivity around the timing of the gift. Is the giver of the gift currently seeking business with the agency, or does the giver currently have business with the agency?
Mhm. Those are two separate considerations, too. Do they have business currently? And separately, are they currently seeking business? An entity that has longstanding business with the agency might be treated less sensitively than an entity trying to woo the agency to select them for a contract or to make some other decision in their favor.
Right, definitely. That certainly could make a difference. And then with the next factor, identity, what we're asking here is whether there's a nexus between the employee's duties and the gift giver. Because if there is, then this could increase concerns that the gift might appear to influence the employee.
And in contrast, if you have nothing to do with the work at your agency affecting this outside source because it's handled by a completely different department, there may be fewer concerns.
Right. If it's handled by a completely different department, then the appearance concerns might be reduced, even if some of the other factors could otherwise indicate a problem.
So would an example of that be something like, say I work in the ethics office, and I'm invited to an event that's being hosted by a technology company. And maybe our agency does have a contract with a technology company, but I have nothing to do with procuring technology. I don't oversee it. I don't deploy it. I have kind of nothing to do with that arena. That's a factor that maybe might agitate in the direction of my impartiality not being questioned, because I just couldn't take any action that would affect them.
Right, exactly. That's a factor that might weigh then in that direction. And then finally, with access, what we're looking at here is especially connected with the identity factor, in that if you can affect the giver through your job, or at least if there would be a perception that you could, then what we want you to consider here is whether the appearance concerns potentially go beyond just the gift itself.
Right. That by giving the gift, the giver is getting the opportunity to spend time with you and influence you that others wouldn't get. Not all gifts are tangible. It could be an offer of attendance at a reception.
I think this is starting to make sense to me. So we have to take these all together. So, for example, if I was invited to coffee by a potential contractor and we were on the way to a source selection or a bidding process, even though that's the thing I might receive might only be worth a few dollars, the ability to access me at a very sensitive time in the government's business by someone who's a principal from the organization seeking business might agitate in me saying no. Because even though I'm just getting a few dollars worth of items, those may produce a result that reflects poorly on the integrity of a process.
Right.
Right.
And
exactly.
As I mentioned earlier, and I think that goes to that point, that even if the gift is relatively cheap, we say still consider all of the factors for the exact reason that you mentioned, Patrick.
Okay. I think that's starting to get clear for me.
Yeah. And even with those little gifts like that, there is that concern kind of cumulatively. Is it just adding something to the regular practice of business that it then seems like buying you a cup of coffee is that price of entry for your time and attention? So we want to be mindful of that as well.
Okay, excellent.
So all of these, the V, T, I, and A that Kim mentioned, the market value, timing, identity, and the donor and access are really important considerations. But one concern is, how do employees remember these factors so that they can reflexively apply them in the moment when they're offered a gift?
Right. So as an ethics official, you need to be able to explain these factors to employees so that employees can use and apply them to carry out their part of the process. And then you also need to be familiar with them yourself to provide prudential guidance to employees who come to you with questions. So yeah, both you and the employees need to remember them so that you can put them into action. It's a great point, Suzanne. And so here's one way. This is a mnemonic that you can use. Valiant tigers ice skate awkwardly. And the first letter of each word helps you to recall a factor in the analysis: value, timing, identity, and access. Because when it comes to remembering information, the sillier the better.
So I know it could sometimes feel like we shouldn't use humor in ethics training because we don't want to make light of the subject, but used appropriately in like this example, it can help us to learn. So that's a good thing. I've already been using this, and I have to thank Kim for that because she came up with this mnemonic. And it's a useful tool for remembering the factors and how to apply them to every gift situation.
That's just, I think, especially with when we have 4 factors. So, I have trouble when you get much more than 3. So I'm
Right.
grateful for anything that helps me remember.
Yeah, we can especially use that around this time of year when people tend to be busy with other things, and we just need all the help we can get, I think, with that.
Yeah.
And the purpose of this mnemonic is to serve as a trigger to bring up information. So it is critical that we as ethics officials and our agency employees know the key questions in the VTIA analysis that we discussed on the previous slide and how to apply them prior to using this. But once you're at that point and know those factors and questions, then again, the sillier the better, and it will help you remember to apply them.
No, there is nothing wrong with your computer screen. And you won't be able to unsee what you're seeing. But that's the point. Hopefully this image will be imprinted in your mind to help you recall what we've just covered.
Exactly. A lot of us have a preference for visual learning. So we can add on to the mnemonic as a learning aid by putting this visual image associated with it. And once you remember this and associate it with the mnemonic, you're more likely to remember it and be able to have that as a trigger to help you remember the underlying questions that you need to ask to do a VTIA analysis. So now let's put this together and walk through the mechanics of applying the standard of not accepting a gift if it creates appearance concerns. So first, employees are to apply the standard, just as is also the case with 2635.502, the consideration of appearances by the employee. And second, this isn't meant to be punitive. Employees may not be punished if they do not apply the standard, or if the employee's application of the standard and, say, your application lead to different conclusions. I want to specifically note that this standard is unlike, in this respect, it's unlike the standard in section 2635.502 in that the ethics official may not direct the employee to decline an otherwise permissible gift.
So if the employee thinks that based on the application of the standard and factors, he can accept the gift, but you, as an ethics official, think it's advisable based on this standard and the factors to decline the gift, and the employee accepts anyway, what the regulation says is that the agency cannot punish him for that.
Right. The standard is here to help employees to learn and to grow in their ethical decision making. It's not about playing gotcha after the fact.
And of course, we want ethics officials to train the employees on the standard and factors, but the employees should also feel free to come to you as an ethics official for their analysis of the situation.
I think those are both really important points because often when we're offered a gift, it's not convenient to seek ethics advice immediately. We may have to make a determination about whether we're going to accept or not accept something of value in the moment. So practicing this process with your employees can really give them the tools to make that decision for themselves when the opportunity arises.
Right. Yeah, we definitely want to stress that even when employees do come to you for ethics advice, not to bypass this process, really to use that as an opportunity to work with the employee and support them in also thinking through the factors on their own, because they may then in the future encounter a situation when you're not readily available and they need to apply it themselves.
Okay, excellent.
And that's really the objective of what we're focusing on here, so that it comes to the employee and the ethics official reflexively to consider declining otherwise permissible gifts if they've done the analysis and it looks like that's the best option.
Exactly.
So now that we've reinforced the standard for declining otherwise permissible gifts and always applying a reasonable person standard to any ethics scenario, our next step in the gifts analysis process is for the employee to ask, is this a gift? So the Standards of Conduct provides a definition at 5 CFR section 2635.203, which is on your screen right now. And it basically states that a gift is anything having monetary value, whether tangible or intangible. So a gift can be a favor, like giving an employee a ride to work or covering the cost of a taxi ride. It could also be a box of chocolates, an invitation to a reception at an embassy, or an invitation to a contractor's holiday party, or the forbearance of a debt that you owe. And these are just some examples.
And for this immediate exercise, let's say that a fertilizer company is offering an employee a commercially sold book of new horticultural discoveries, and the employee is a government botanist.
Okay, does Greens and Things, the book charting the horticultural bestseller list, meet the definition of a gift? And pretty much any tangible item, as we just said, will meet that definition. And since Kim just said this is a book with commercial value, that just adds to our deduction that, yes, this is a gift. So while we're looking to determine if an item meets the definition of a gift, and we have to determine if an item is excluded from the definition of a gift, the standards provides exclusions. And the exclusions include items which you can see on the slide before you. And these exclusions would likely not call into question an employee's impartiality or cause an appearance issue. So please take a few moments to glance over these general categories of exclusions. We're going to revisit them in a little bit. Okay, so modest items offered for consumption would not be a gift. That would be a gift exclusion. So if you're offered a cup of coffee and a croissant at a meeting, you can go ahead and partake of these snacks. And note that these are snacks, not a full meal. Items of little intrinsic value, like a greeting card, and we'll probably see a lot of those this holiday season, a certificate for being the guest speaker at a conference. These sorts of things are not considered gifts.
Right. Now, if that certificate came in a sterling silver frame, we've traveled beyond the realm of gift exclusions and back to the land of gifts.
Exactly. And when a telephone company offers a class consisting of all government employees a discount, not a special subgroup, but the entire class of government employees, then employees may accept. And the list goes on. We're not going to review them all with you today, but for a refresher, please take a look at section 2635.203B, where you'll see fuller coverage of the exclusions and some good examples. And that's in one of your handouts that we provided for you below your slides today. The botany book we're looking at today does not meet one of the gift exclusions.
Okay. So to recap where we are, let's look again at our gifts analysis diagram. So an analysis was conducted whereby first the employee or the employee with the help of an ethics official went through the VTIA steps to determine if a reasonable person with knowledge of the facts would question the employee's impartiality or integrity in accepting the gift being offered. And if the answer to that was yes, then the employee should consider declining the gift. Here we're blending values and rules-based ethics, and this is the new default for approaching gifts from outside sources.
And if after conducting this analysis, the answer is no, then the employee's impartiality and integrity would not be questioned. The next step is determining if the item offered meets the regulatory definition of a gift, or if the item is excluded from the definition of a gift. So we've now named the item, which is the horticulture book, and determined that it does indeed meet the definition of a gift. There's no gift exclusion that applies.
Right. So now we have to ask, is the gift prohibited? Meaning, is it from a prohibited source, or was it offered based on the employee's official position?
So we've determined that the item was a gift, and we asked, is it prohibited? So please take a moment to look at the slide on your screen. This is a summary of the general prohibition on gifts from outside sources. And the general rule is an employee may not accept a gift from a prohibited source or based on their official position unless an exception applies.
And those are two separate standards, am I correct? So it only has to meet
Correct.
one of those. So it could be from a prohibited source given for a reason other than the official position, and it's
Exactly.
prohibited. Or it could be given from anyone because of my official position, and that would also be prohibited.
Exactly. That is the general rule. Correct.
Excellent. So I'd like to think of those as sort of two separate items. I consider one and then the other, and I find that helps me avoid mistakes.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's broken out here. So we know you're likely familiar with the definition of a prohibited source, but we're covering it here. This is also on your screen right now, and we're covering it since it's an important step in the gifts analysis process.
Right. So here are some examples of what would be a prohibited source. It could be the provider of software upgrades for your agency's computer system. It could be companies who must abide by your agency's regulations. It could be a contractor who works side by side with you on a regular basis. Or maybe it's a trade association made up of members who are themselves prohibited sources, or a drug manufacturer whose drug application is pending for your approval. All of those would be prohibited sources.
So going back to our government botanist who was offered the horticulture book, I think we need to know more about what our botanist does, like where he works and if there's any nexus with the fertilizer company that offered him the book.
Right. So, for example, do they have any business before the agency? Does the agency regulate their products? Does our botanist have duties which could impact the fertilizer company? Those are some of the questions that we would want to be asking.
So in this case, let's say the company is a prohibited source because the company has products that are regulated by the agency.
Okay, so we've already gone through the VTIA analysis, determined that the item in question is a gift because it does not meet one of the gift exclusions, and it is from a prohibited source because the company produces products regulated by the agency.
So from our graph here, we can now see that we're at the point in our analysis process where we're asking, is there an exception? Does an exception apply? And the exceptions to the prohibition for acceptance of certain gifts are found at 5 CFR section 2635.204. If you've printed out Subpart B, which we provided for you, you can take a look at the exceptions therein. If not, we'll come back later in the presentation to talk more about them. So don't worry if you don't have your list before you.
Exactly. And we've been stressing that the first question employees and ethics officials should be asking is, are there appearance concerns? And that the way to do that is the VTIA analysis. So we're going to come back to that before we go back and look in further depth at the exceptions.
And if you take one thing away from this training, we hope it'll be that you should analyze for appearances first. And I know some of you are probably wondering, why does it need to happen first? Why do we need to analyze appearances first? And why do we train employees to do it?
Exactly. So we're going to step back and spend some time together looking at those two questions.
Okay, so this is a busy slide which exaggerates some of the exceptions to the prohibition on accepting gifts from outside sources using an old framework of looking at gifts. Let's take a closer look at what's happening in this image.
Right. Well, they do say December is the season of giving. And so here we have various exhortations that employees can freely accept certain items they might be offered around the holiday season because there's an exception. We've got gifts from vendors worth $20 or less, trade associations, holiday gala, reception at an embassy. And it ends by saying, hoping you have a very exceptional holiday season.
And in reality, we want you to have a good holiday season, but maybe not an exceptional one, which is why we've put these red flags on the side, because we don't want you to use anything like this messaging for your training with employees.
Right. Yeah. Don't use this type of messaging in your employee training, but it is important sometimes to turn a mirror on ourselves as a community, to take stock and to assess where we are. What message does this send out to employees about ethics? And would the outcomes of that line up with what our intentions are for the ethics program?
No, I think that's interesting, because I think we're all sort of guilty of this, treating Subpart B as the gift acceptance regulation from
Exactly,
prohibited sources
yes.
rather than the prohibition on accepting gifts from prohibited sources. And, perhaps that's a result of the volume of words in the regulation being mostly focused on exceptions.
Mhm.
But really, we should not forget that initial purpose. And I think the new reg does a good job of bringing us back to that purpose.
Exactly. It brings us back into that purpose and perhaps catches us where, sometimes at this time of the year, even in the midst of the exuberance for the holiday season, there can be that kind of reflexive response to focus on the exceptions more than the overall purpose.
Right. And we don't want to send a message that this is all about giving license to employees to go out and accept gifts reflexively without considering the reasons behind the ethical standards we have in the federal government.
Right, exactly. Because too much focus on the exceptions can affect an employee's ethical decision making. And we're going to look at that decision making part from an employee's perspective, how the messaging or how the framing can affect the employee's ethical decision making. And here we're going to start looking at that.
So here's a situation an employee might experience. And let's put ourselves in this employee's shoes and try to get a sense of how the employee might experience this situation. So where the scenario says you, think of yourself as being the employee.
Right. So you're at a procurement outreach event hosted by your agency's IT department where you work as a program manager. And then in just a couple hours, you talk with the representatives for 35 companies interested in bidding on parts of an upcoming computer contract. And then near lunchtime, you strike up a conversation with the representative for Remote Works. And it turns out, well, hey, you went to the same college and both of you continued to avidly follow the sports program there. And then he asks you if you'll let him buy you lunch at the sandwich shop down the street. You've been there before, and you know that they have a great $8 lunch meal deal special. So what we're facing here as this employee is an on-the-spot decision about this lunch invitation from a potential vendor. And also, maybe things are seeming a little bit blurry because we have struck up a little bit of a personal conversation as well.
Right. And there might be a pastrami sandwich involved.
Yeah, there's some food involved, and it's right before lunch. Your stomach may be starting to growl too, so that could be another factor at play also.
And I want to know where you can get this $8 lunch. That's what I want to know. But
pick any small city outside of the district.
yeah, somewhere outside of DC. But hopefully we at least see that there's some kind of an ethics issue here. And hopefully we work at an agency where ethics is salient, meaning it stands out. And meaning we're likely to see the situation has an ethical dimension, that a potential vendor inviting you to lunch has an ethical dimension, and you see that.
Right. Yeah, and so for the sake of this example, we are going to assume that. We're going to assume that the possibility of an ethical dimension to a lunch invitation from a potential vendor is at the front of your mind. And so then what happens next? Well, remember, you have to make a quick decision here. So this question, can I accept the lunch, might pop into your mind. And a question like this focuses on one aspect of the decision. Is it technically legal for you to accept this lunch?
Right. You may have had past ethics training that approached the offer of a gift as a question of, is it permissible under the rules? Is there an exception? How can I get this lunch?
Right. And with the changes OGE made to the gift rules starting in 2017, we intentionally were wanting to shift employees and ethics officials away from this question, because can I accept the lunch is a very specific way of framing the decision that the employee has to make. And the frame that you put around that decision also impacts what you see and what you don't see about the ethical dimensions of the situation. So your decision is framed in a particular way, and you're under this time pressure to decide what to do about this lunch. What next?
So your mind is probably going to gravitate to a quick rule of thumb. Maybe your first thought is the 20-50 rule, whereby an employee may accept an unsolicited gift worth $20 or less.
Right. And well, you've been to this lunch place before, your lunch will only cost $8. So you know what to do, right?
Pastrami time.
Yeah, pastrami time. You've got this.
Half a
You can take the
pastrami
lunch.
sandwich for $8.
So just to emphasize what we've been saying about can I accept this lunch as a particular kind of framing question, I think a lot of us want to think that ideally, when faced with an ethical dilemma, that we would see the full picture, that we would see all of the potential ethical dimensions. But the research says that really our ethical decision making is bounded. And what that means is that it fails in predictable ways.
Right. We think we see the big picture.
Right. But actually, what we're seeing is something more like this. And framing is one factor. It's a very important factor that can affect the bounds of what we see. So if our framing question is focused only on the yes or no, legal or not dimensions of the question, then we may only see something like this.
So we may not see the warning signals. What would the other vendors at the conference think if we accept this lunch? Will accepting the lunch undermine the purpose of the outreach event? And how's it going to look to others if I'm friends with one of the bidders?
Right. Yeah, we may not see the warning signals that by accepting the lunch, we are giving this one vendor a lot more of our time than we're giving to any of the other vendors. Or let's say we just keep things personal. We might not see how developing a friendship now with this vendor could have an ethical dimension down the road when the vendor submits a bid for the contract. And the framing might affect our decision making in other ways as well.
Right. Maybe we get these warning signals, but we've been taught that if an exception applies, that means the lunch is mine. The regulation entitles me to that lunch. At this point, if you're getting the warning signals after considering the exceptions, that can set up a different kind of framing called a loss aversion.
Right, meaning you thought that lunch was yours, and now if you tune it back and listen to these warning signals, you might have to give it up.
Right. You had something, and now there's a risk of losing that if you listen to the warning signals. So at this point, we have to make our decision under time pressure. We're under time constraints. Are we going to say, you know what, I'm just not going to go. I'm just going to decline the lunch.
Decline the pastrami sandwich.
Right. You know, are we going to do that? Well, there it goes. Well, maybe, but the research on loss aversion, what it says is actually we're much more likely to take risks to keep from losing something that we see as ours than we are to take risks to gain something that we don't have yet.
Right. Even if we do have an inkling of other potential concerns, we're more likely to want to go ahead and accept the lunch and just hope no one notices.
So make sure that we don't leave any crumbs behind for
Exactly,
someone investigating the lunch.
Exactly.
We're going to have to buy you a pastrami sandwich. And for more on that, see gifts from between employees. See the guidance on gifts between employees.
Yeah. And the reason this happens is because we're loss averse. It's more likely that we're going to have a reaction like that because of this natural aversion to a loss that we have.
Right. And analyzing for appearances first, as we've stressed, is the first step in the GIST analysis process, and it helps to address this.
Right. It helps to address it because the ordering of having employees first ask whether their impartiality or integrity will be questioned before they look at possible exceptions helps to increase the odds that employees will make ethically sound decisions.
So it's not really natural for us to do this, which is why we have to practice, right?
Exactly. We have to practice it. We have to get in the hang of it because it isn't the natural reaction that we might otherwise have.
That makes a lot of sense.
So here's the same scenario that we've been looking at.
But now the employee has expanded his frame of decision-making to include the VTIA analysis process, which you could see on the right side of your screen.
Mm-hmm. And the goal of the new analysis process is that employees will take a broader view when faced with an ethical dilemma. They'll ask themselves, what are they going to do, rather than focus more narrowly on whether they can technically, legally accept the gift or not.
Right. They're going to walk through the VTIA analysis before making that decision.
Right, right. So they're going to remember the image. They're going to say Valiant Tigers ice skate awkwardly. And now, if I was this employee on the spot having to make a decision about this lunch, maybe I think what I might do is try to buy some time, because it can be really difficult to make a good decision when you're under that quick time pressure. And once I bought some time, then I do my VTIA analysis, or, maybe that would just be kind of awkward. And I just decide, what, this offer of a lunch isn't really worth that effort. And I would just go ahead and on the spot, maybe I would just decline it. And that would be okay too.
Absolutely. And I think this is an area where it can be helpful to have thought about this before you attend the trade show. Knowing that you're going to be in contact with a lot of vendors who might soon have business before your agency, you may prepare yourself for this situation and say, you know what, if I'm offered anything, I'm just not going to accept it, because that's another strategy that we can take some of the timing pressures off of ourselves.
Yeah.
And, in this example, the fellow in question at the conference, he went to college with the person, but he's not necessarily a good friend of his. So it raises even further appearance concerns.
Yeah, definitely. And it could be a great idea too, if as an ethics official that an event like this is going to be happening at your agency, maybe working with supervisors to just insert a quick ethics message in the last staff meeting before the big event.
Yes.
Kind of getting at what Patrick was saying. It does help to address that time factor if you are anticipating this and have had a few moments to reflect on what you're going to do.
No, absolutely. So the preparedness is better than needing to triage it in the field.
Yes.
So to summarize, this is what OGE hopes will result from building in an analysis of appearances by employees as the first step of the gifts analysis process. First, it puts the employee's focus on, should I accept this, rather than how can I accept this. Then next, it requires employees to engage in ethical decision making. So we're really building up employee skill here just through the use of this process, and has the potential to carry over into other areas beyond just gifts. Then third, it requires employee ownership of his or her actions.
And finally, it also relieves pressure on ethics officials, because the first question becomes the VTIA analysis, not can I accept this gift? So we're now going to turn back to talking about the regulatory exceptions.
And with our gifts analysis process, we're now back on the final step. Is there an exception?
As we mentioned before, you can find the exceptions in 2635.204 of the standards. And I'll give you a few moments to take a look at Subpart B of the regulations, which, again, reminding you, we provided for you in the course materials.
Right. So now that you've had a chance to, just to skim through those materials, there are a number of exceptions, and we're going to look at some of those in some detail when we do get to the scenarios.
For purposes of the analysis process and our government botanist, who we have not forgotten, you'll want to take a look at whether an exception applies. Remember, he was offered that commercially sold gift, greens and things. And you'll need to know the market value of the book. But should you have this information, or you should actually have this information as it was in the VTIA analysis. And if an exception doesn't apply, that ends the analysis right there, and the gift cannot be accepted.
Right. And if an exception does apply, then you do want to weigh the VTIA analysis before the employee makes a decision. And we've provided you with a handy job reference aid, again, also as part of the course materials available right below the video, that provides the gifts from outside sources process that we've been using today. And it also provides some summaries of the exclusions as from the definition of the gift, as well as some summaries of the exceptions.
So while we're looking at exceptions, we have to consider if the employee is coming to us with a gifts question, or the employee coming to us with a gifts question is covered by Executive Order 13770, and ask, is this person a pledge signer? Is this person a federal appointee? If so, this person will be further restricted regarding the exception of gifts.
Right, exactly, because the ethics pledge contains a ban on appointees accepting gifts from lobbyists.
Exactly. So for gifts from lobbyists or lobbying organizations, the executive order removes the availability of certain gifts exceptions. So the exceptions which still apply are the ones shown here on your screen. And these are gifts based on personal relationships, discounts and similar benefits, gifts resulting from a spouse's business or employment relationship, customary gifts or gratuities provided by a prospective employer, gifts to a president or vice president of the United States, gifts authorized by an OG-approved agency supplemental regulation, and gifts under specific statutory authorities.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting to look at the logic behind the lobbyist gift ban, because I think it's very complementary to the VTIA analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Because in both cases, we're concerned about gifts being used to create access and influence, right, which is really the industry of lobbying. So you can see them as sort of complementary, and this just being a heightened codification for those more senior officials.
Exactly. For those more senior officials, we have that more heightened codification of it. So if the person we happen to be advising is a pledge signer, then again, we have to remember that this specific ban does apply, and it's going to constrain the availability of our exceptions that we can apply if the gift's from a lobbying organization or from a lobbyist.
Right. I think especially because a lot of pledge signers are more in the public sphere. So there's more concern about appearances. Mm-hmm. So even if an exception does apply, we still want to apply, as Patrick mentioned, we still want to apply the VTIA analysis, and maybe especially for political appointees or just government appointees who may be subject to more public scrutiny than other employees concerning the decisions they make.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, we've discussed the advice and counseling process. Remember that wheel that we had at the beginning, with an emphasis on consideration for declining otherwise permissible gifts. We've used a circular diagram, that wheel, for the advice and counseling process, and we've taken a linear approach to the gifts analysis process with a look at the definition of a gift, the exclusions that might apply, and the exceptions that might apply. So it's now time to apply what we've learned.
Okay, so we've got our first scenario here, and Cal is a federal employee, and he received an invitation to attend a holiday reception from a prohibited source.
So my first thought is, the first thought that comes to me is, and maybe because we were just discussing it, but is Cal a pledge signer? Is Cal a government appointee?
Yeah, exactly. If we don't know Cal that well, we need to know more about Cal. And even if we didn't look at whether he is a political appointee right here at the start of our analysis, we'd certainly need to consider that when we look at the exceptions that might apply. So in this case, let's say that Cal is a political appointee.
Okay, so we also want to know what he does and where he works. But first, let's go through the VTIA process. And again, that's on the right side of the slide. The thing about the VTIA process is that if there's an issue with the timing or the identity of the donor, for example, you may want to stop right there and determine that it's not a good idea to even look further at whether the gift is acceptable or not.
Right. If Cal is right on the eve of making a decision on whether to subsidize widget production, and the invitation is from the Widget Manufacturers of America, and it's to their black tie holiday gala, and even if Cal knows other government people have been invited as well, it might be a good idea for Cal just to stop here.
That makes sense because the value of the black tie gala is quite high. Presumably, the timing at the eve of that decision is not great, right? And the access and identity also weigh against, because this is someone who's seeking a decision from this particular official.
Right.
So it's sort of a tick all 4 boxes.
Yeah. And the appearances could be very questionable. So let's say we've gone through the VTIA analysis. It is a gift. It is from a prohibited source, and then an exception might apply. Let's say the exception at 5 CFR 2635.204G for widely attended gatherings. And that's an exception. So let's say that applies.
Right. And that exception, with written approval, if certain conditions are met, it would allow for opportunities for employees to meet informally after hours with a variety of different stakeholders. And sometimes this can be used for holiday events. So in this case, though, we have another factor. We know that Cal is a political appointee. So we also know that the WAG exception won't be available if the widget association is a registered lobbying organization, or if the invitation is from a registered lobbyist.
Right. So overall, what we're saying here is that every factor matters, and it should not be just good enough to say, oh, there's an exception for widely attended gatherings, even if it turns out that the invitation wasn't from a registered lobbyist. That it shouldn't be okay to just say, oh, there's an exception because it's the season of giving and good cheer. We always want to consider appearances,
Right, exactly. It should not be enough to say, just because it's the holiday season, that we don't have to consider these other factors as well. Okay, so let's take a look at a second scenario. So here, during an anonymous gift exchange at the agency's IT division holiday party, Isabella, an IT specialist for the agency, receives a sugar cookie scented candle, and several of the agency's IT support contractors participated in the exchange. So we have a gift exchange, and government employees and contractors are participating in it. And Isabella, a government employee, received a candle. It might have been one of the gifts that was put into the exchange by one of the contractors, or it might have been put into the exchange by a colleague.
And just for a moment, you may be thinking, just as an aside, is it okay for a government employee to give a gift to a contractor? And the short answer is that there's nothing in the standards that prohibits it, but we can't speak to any other rules a contractor's own code of conduct might detail. So the short answer is that the standards doesn't address that.
Exactly. But the contractor may have their own code of conduct that has something to say about that.
Right.
And so as to the standards and our employee Isabella, first, let's look at the VTIA. And with the value, it would be typical at an agency to set a limit of $10 or less for gift exchange gifts, because as you are probably familiar, the limitations on gifts to official superiors or to employees making more pay that are found in Subpart C of the Standards of Conduct on gifts between employees. We might make that choice in terms of advising employees at our agency that they set that limit for their gift exchanges.
So, and it certainly seems, or let's assume we've seen this particular candle and we've deduced it's less than $10, maybe a regifted candle. Anyway, they still need to go through the VTIA analysis. And one thing we know for sure is that the identity of the donor is unknown. So although we know that the gift could possibly be from a contractor, we don't know for sure that it is from a contractor. But because it could be, we have to assume that it is, at least for our analysis.
Right. So we know that the candle, which is a gift because it doesn't meet one of the gift exclusions, might be from a prohibited source because it might be from an agency contractor. And then we can look at possible exceptions. And so there is an exception for gifts valued at $20 or less, as long as the employee doesn't accept $50 or or more in gifts from that same source in the calendar year, or so frequently from the same source that a reasonable person would question their impartiality.
Right. So that exception might be available. But I think we should also verify that the employee is not a political appointee, although it does seem like an IT specialist would not be, but we should still consider it, because if the employee is an appointee who signed the ethics pledge, the exception for gifts worth $20 or less is not available if this contractor is a registered lobbyist.
Right.
Okay, so now our third scenario. A court reporting and transcription services vendor who would welcome being hired to provide services to your agency's Office of Hearings and Appeals drops off a box of chocolate eclairs for the department's administrative officer, the AO, for the holidays. The AO comes to you for advice. What advice would you provide to the employee? So first, again, on the right-hand side of your screen, we're looking at the VTIA process. And we know from the start that the I, the identity, is a prohibited source because the vendor is seeking business with the AO's agency. So do we know the value of the gift?
Right. And we're also going to look at the timing to see if the agency is actively looking at changes to hire new court reporting services. And on the value, let's say it's 24 mini eclairs from a nice bakery. And then how about access? Well, here, let's say that the vendor is gone. We're just left with this box of perishable eclairs.
At this point, after the VTIA analysis, the AO may decide, with or without our input, that the gift should be declined. The AO might also decide to continue the gifts analysis process and see if a gift exception applies.
Right. So if the AO wants to continue the analysis, again, we know that this is a big box of eclairs, and we know that it is a gift because it's more than a modest food item. And we know it's prohibited because it's from a vendor who's seeking business with the agency. So the last step is to look to see if there's an exception that applies.
Ooh, a delicious eclairs exception.
Someone is hungry and ready for lunch.
Yes.
So it seems likely that 24 bakery eclairs would cost more than $20. So we could rule out the 2050 gifts exception. And I can't see that any other exceptions would apply.
Right. So either way, if this employee ended the analysis after doing the VTIA analysis and decided not to accept it, or if we went through the full analysis process with the employee and determined that the employee couldn't accept it because there's no exception available, there is a standard in the regulation for proper disposition of otherwise prohibited gifts.
Right. And that's at 5 CFR section 2635.206. This is all in Subpart B that we provided for you. And it says that there are some options that, with the approval of your supervisor or agency designee, that part is important, with the approval of your supervisor or agency designee, with these with their consultation, you would have the option to dispose of perishable items that are not practical for you to return. So other options include giving the eclairs to an appropriate charity, sharing the eclairs within the office, or destroying them, such as by throwing them out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's our last scenario.
Yeah, and we want to thank you so much for joining us for this training on gifts from outside sources, brought to you by the OG's Institute for Ethics in Government.
Mm-hmm. And if you have questions about this training specifically, then please do email us at trainingregistration@oge.gov. Or if you have questions about the gift rules themselves, then please feel free to reach out to your agency's OGE desk officer, and we're happy to answer further questions that you bring to your desk officer.
So Suzanne and Kim, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to help us think about the new regulations and especially consider them in the context of the coming holiday season. And we'd also like to thank all of you for joining us. We hope you found this presentation helpful. And like with all of our broadcasts, if you registered for the course, you will be receiving a course evaluation. We do ask that you complete that if you're able to. Also, if you have ideas for future trainings, please let us know, because we do try and accommodate those to the extent we're able to. And we really want to make sure that the sessions and topics we're offering are those that are of interest to the community. So we look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, I'm Patrick Shepard.